just in case I need it. So I'm going to talk about design conceptualization in unit load operations of warehouses. And before I go any further, I should say that a lot of what I'm going to present is part of joint work that has been done with several of the collaborators. So I should mention all of them. So Sundaresh, whom you heard from a little while ago, has been a collaborator on a couple of research projects that we've done, along with Charlie Monberg at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. A lot of the hard work that went behind this was done by a lot of our PhD students that were involved in this. So a lot of credit goes to them as well. We had several industry partners that made sure that our 2 feet were on the ground while we were doing this research. And so Sava, Wonderland, and MHIA were valuable contacts. Lastly, this would not have been possible without the government support, and in some ways you play a role because you paid your taxes, and so the government had some money. And so some of the NSF grants that we got have been extremely valuable in making sure we are able to do this research. So my objective today is for the next about 50 minutes or so, talk a little bit about what we mean by unit load operations in warehouses. So some of you may be new to this topic, so I just want to put what unit load operations mean, and I want to talk about what do we mean by design conceptualization. Okay, so we'll talk about what unit load operations are in warehouses, what do we mean by design conceptualization, what kind of decisions are we usually talking about, and I'm going to use AVSRS as an example because that aligns with a lot of the research work that we've done recently, and most of the talk, I'm going to use AVSRS technology as an example that can be used in unit load operations, and use that to illustrate some of the design trade-offs and the design questions that people usually answer. Okay, and they're going to be looking at those design trade-offs at 3 levels: single tier, some blocking effects, some vertical transfer mechanism choices. And then I'm going to try and wrap it up with how models for design conceptualization actually help in practice. Okay. Now, as much as I'm going to build on the research work that we've done, I am not going to focus much on the analytical or the techniques that are being used. Because that may not be of as much interest to you as the general principles and the questions that are being asked. Okay. So as you look through the presentation, as you hear what I say, don't worry about how we got the results, the algorithms that were used to get the results, but think about the questions that were being asked and the kind of trade-off decisions that were being answered as a result of some of these decisions. So just as a background, of course, we realize that distribution centers are an important portion of the supply chain. And I have, in my conversations with several researchers and industry practitioners, I have faced this dilemma of whether to call it a distribution center or a warehouse. So I put warehouse in parentheses in case people don't understand what I mean when I say a distribution center. But I presume, at least this is the perception I got talking to people in industry, that people don't like to call it warehouses anymore. People like to call it distribution centers. Warehouses are an old term which essentially gives the impression of a dark place which people are driving diesel forklift trucks. But today a lot more happens in a distribution center. I mean, there's state-of-the-art technology that goes in there. And so I think the word distribution center aligns better with what happens today. So that's a choice that you can make. Now, this is an overview of what happens or how a distribution center looks like. And so Keith talked about some of this in his talk as well. So typically the kinds of activities that go on in a warehouse, you receive goods from suppliers, and typically those are pallet loads. And then one of the first things that happens with those pallet loads is you take those pallet loads, put them in a reserve storage or a pallet picking area. And that's really what we call as the unit load area, because the load is in the form of a pallet, and that's a unit, and that's how we look at. And so my presentation is mainly going to talk about what happens in that area. But between putting away these pallets in the reserve area and things going to shipping, usually when you get customer orders, these pallets are broken down into cases. Sometimes these cases are broken down into further units or eaches, and then there is a lot of accumulation, sorting, and packaging going on based on the particular customer requirements. And so the presentations you heard earlier from Keith today talked about some of the case picking aspects of it. My presentation is going to talk about the unit load operations related to it. In distribution centers, there's probably a small portion of stuff that comes from the receiving dock and is directly cross-docked into shipping. Most cases, it's a small fraction. If you have dedicated cross-docking facilities, then those may be only doing the cross-docking operations. Okay. Yes?
Because I'm going to show this exact figure. Do you know the origin of that diagram?
It is probably from Bartholdi's book or from somewhere. Tompkins.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Arrow, and I think that's from the
So you have the arrow.
Yeah, we added one arrow, and I think it's the diagram.
Okay. All right.
That's the side of a good graphic, right? When it's in everyone's presentations and no one really knows where it came from.
Where it came from. All right. Okay, good. Now that, thank you. All right. So the idea is to look at the reserve picking or the pallet load storage and receiving area. And unlike the case or the order picking, where a lot of the operations may be manual, in the pallet load, there is a fair amount of automation that happens in many cases because of some of the flexibility requirements that are required. So I'm going to show you a couple of popular technologies, and you heard about ASRS systems in our talk earlier this morning. So just to put things in perspective, for those that are probably not very familiar with ASRS systems, so these are automated storage and retrieval systems that primarily use cranes. So here are the aisles where you are storing palletized unit loads. So those are in blue. So the first thing you'll notice is it's fairly dense, and that's very typical. When you're storing these pallets, it's a high density storage area. People usually don't walk in here. It's automated, so you have storage retrieval devices that are putting in and bringing out these loads. These loads are taken into an aisle by aisle captive cranes. By that I mean that these cranes are dedicated to an aisle. They just go in, put the load, and bring those back. At the front of these aisles is an accumulation conveyor that provides the movement of these loads along this axis, which I would call as x-axis. And the cranes are able to move in the y dimension as well as in the z dimension. And usually when a crane is moving a load, it can do the y and z direction movement simultaneously, and we call that as Chebyshev travel. Okay, and why do I go into some of the details of how an ASRS system works is because I'm going to contrast that with a system called an autonomous vehicle-based storage retrieval systems, or AVSRS, that actually does the same thing of storing and retrieving palletized loads, but it does it in a slightly different manner, and it's a different technology. And so the way that technology works, here again is the high density storage area, and so what you see, the lines in blue are rails where the loads can move. What you see in red on the right of this picture is the autonomous vehicle. It's a battery powered vehicle that has wheels and allows that vehicle to travel in the x and the y direction. So it can travel along the x-axis, it can travel along the y-axis, along those blue rails. What it cannot do is transfer loads vertically. To transfer loads vertically, it takes lifts, and it goes up and down using the lifts, and the lift is what you see here. It's not a very fancy technology, but there is a key difference between how the AVSRS system works and how the ASRS system works. So in the ASRS system, the crane used to go in the y and z directions. Here, the vehicle can go in the x and y, and it needs the lift for the z direction. Okay, so just to make sure everybody understands how that system works, I'm just going to show you a small animation here. So here is the high density storage area. Here's a vehicle with a palletized load going along the x-axis. There are other loads coming along the y-axis. the vehicle and the load sit on the lift takes it down and brings the store load back. Okay, so a couple of things that are key here. First of all, the movement, and I'll play that again so that you can. So a couple of things to realize is that there is an aisle which is in this y direction. There is a cross aisle that is shared by the different vehicles that use the cross aisle to go between aisles or take the lift, and then the lift takes the load up and down, and it could also be shared between the different vehicles that are in the system. Okay, so that's how the system works, and there are reasons to believe that there are advantages of doing an ASRS versus an AVSRS system and so on. But the purpose of this presentation is not really to compare either of these technologies. Okay, my purpose of only showing you this technology is I'm going to use this technology as an example to talk about the issues or questions that people face during design conceptualization. Okay, there's a lot of literature on ASRS and AVSRS systems, and so what I'm going to talk about is not just based on stuff that I've done, but also several others. So if you're interested in ASRS system, I have a couple of slides with a lot of these references, and I know these slides are going to be made available to you, so these could be used as reading material. And there is similar literature on the AVSRS systems as well. And just to summarize the differences between the two technologies, the ASRS uses conveyor in the X direction to move loads in front of the aisles and uses the cranes within these aisles, and the load movement is Chebyshev. That means you can do the Y and Z direction movement simultaneously in many cases. In the AVSRS, vehicles and lifts are the devices that you use. The travel is rectilinear, X and Y, so you cannot do a diagonal motion. Usually you have one load-unload point per zone or per aisle. And the system throughput in the ASRS system is determined by the number of cranes and the number of aisles that are there. And in an AVSRS system, the throughput is determined by the number of vehicles and number of lifts that are there in the system. These are not only two technologies for unit load operations, but as I said, this is not a review of everything all the technologies that are there for unit load. I'm only going to use AVSRS to illustrate some of these conceptualization issues. Okay. So what do I mean by design conceptualization? So what are we typically interested when we are talking about design conceptualization? So in any system, and using AVSRS as an example, if you're talking about design conceptualization, you are interested in some system design decisions, some operational decisions, and some cost and performance decisions. So a system sizing decision is, okay, if I have a customer requirement, how many material handling devices should I have? How many vehicles should I have? How many lifts should I have in the system? If I have control, what should be the ratio of the depth versus the width of the high density storage area? And I say if I have the control, because sometimes the plot of land that you have dictates the depth to width ratio or puts some constraints on the depth to width ratio. Sometimes with it, you have the ability to dictate whether you want a long, narrow storage area or you want something that's more square. Okay? So those are some of the questions. Then you have the question of where do you locate the cross aisle. So we saw that there was one cross aisle that was being used in the system. Do we create zones and so on? The operational decisions are, how do you use these vehicles? You have these storage retrieval devices. How do you use these vehicles? Where do they dwell after they do a transaction? So where is their parking spot? Where do they sit? What kind of command cycle do you do? So do you pair a storage with a retrieval, or do you do only retrievals and then only storages? And what are the trade-offs between that? What kind of scheduling policies do you have? What kind of storage policies do you have? Do you store all your items in the high density area in random fashion, or do you store certain items